This camera was the subject of a What's in the Box episode, and I've done a little bit of work on it, so let's take a closer look at it. This is the Kowa SE, and as I mentioned, at first I thought SE might have stood for selenium, but in fact it stands for, I don't know what it stands for, maybe like as a possible special edition, or I'm not really sure. Anyway, as you would notice, I turned the camera upside down. It does have a battery chamber here, and it takes either that PX25 or an SE PX25 or 625 mercury cell, both of which are no longer available. However, you should be able to use a hearing aid battery. Because I don't have a hearing aid battery, I'm going to stick a let's see what will pop in here. Happen to have a silver oxide cell, so let's give that a try. Well, I don't believe the meter. At some point, I'll stick a hearing aid battery in here. The meter looked to be active momentarily, and then it just died. I don't think it was the extra voltage, so I'll probably just use a handheld meter with this. This camera is a bit different in that it has a reasonably fast lens at 1.9, mounted to a Seikosha shutter, and it's a leaf shutter. And you'll see SLV. I'm not really sure why they would put V, but generally the V stands for, the V was the marking for the self-timer on the German shutters. Your apertures are here, and your shutter speed is indicated by this small red mark. There's serrations around the dial, and so you simply turn the dial until you're at your desired shutter speed. Same with the aperture. What sets this apart from, let's say, the German cameras with leaf shutters, for example, is it did have a rapid return mirror. And you can see how that mirror slaps down into position again. So that was this is actually a big plus. I'm not sure when this camera was introduced. Let's use our friend, the search engine. I was going to guess the 1960s, and in fact, this camera was introduced in 1964. What was interesting, this replaced the Model E, which did have a selenium meter. And so this one uses, I took this camera apart and I believe it uses cadmium sulfide, but that wouldn't be unusual because that had become the predominant type of meter for that time period. So, there's a lot to like about this camera. First of all, it focuses very smoothly. Second, although keep in mind, because it was the 1960s, this has a metal focusing ring with serrations and very small scallops. It has a full range of speeds running from 1/500th to 1 second plus B, and it has apertures running from 1.9 to f16, f1.9 to f16. It's not a surprise that it didn't stop down to f22, and that was because there was a feeling that stopping it down past f16 actually degraded the image. Now you'll notice that this is, as I mentioned, this is a 1.9 lens, so that would seem to indicate that it's not a Tessar. Tessar is really maxed out at 2.8. This most likely is I don't know if it'd be a sonar type or planar type. I don't know if the Japanese were ripping off the planar by that time. So it's a somewhat heavy camera. Let's weigh it. So this camera comes in at 1 pound, 15 ounces. So really nearly 2 pounds. And what camera should we weigh in comparison? Well, I happen to have, let's see. Well, you know what? Let's try this Mamiya. The NC1000. I've been doing some work on this camera, so let's see what it weighs. It weighs 1 pound, 7 ounces. So this is, what, 7 ounces heavier? So this camera is 7 ounces heavier, and it's sort of not a surprise because you can really feel how there's a lot of metal in this camera in its construction. There's just a lot of metal. There's not a lot of plastic. I think this is plastic. This little piece here, this surround, and inside probably the eyepiece, and that's probably about it. Everything else about it is, everything else about it, well, I think this is plastic, but for the most part, though, it's metal. So as you can see, it was made in Japan, but that's no surprise because it's a Japanese company. Japanese company at that time were making their cameras in Japan. It's not a particularly quiet camera. I think for a leaf shutter, it was probably on par with other leaf shutter cameras. Although it depended, right? I should say it was on par with other single lens reflex cameras that had a leaf shutter. Although I think one of the quieter ones actually was the Kodak Reflex 2 and 3. I think I have a 4 somewhere. In any case, if you're outside, it's probably not that noticeable. The lens itself the lens itself has markings both in feet and meters, and it focuses down to a close distance of, let's see what that is. Slightly past 0.7 meters, so roughly, I'm going to guess about 2 feet, give or take. And once again, that's a bit better for cameras from that era. All right, let's pop the back again. No surprises back here. Your fresh roll film goes here. You just pull up on the rewind knob. However, unlike other cameras, you don't pull up on the rewind knob to open the back. Instead, there's a small little thing here. Pull up on that, and the back pops open. You have your pressure plate, a roller for your film. And let's see where that roller's. So the roller sits between the sprocket wheel and the take-up spool. And that presumably is to guide it smoothly into position. All right, this is a little light baffle. It's also the back of the mirror. So your fresh roll film goes here. Film runs across the film rails. Take-up spool, the small serrated wheel to get you started, and fire off 2 blanks. Close the back. Close the back. Fire off 2 blanks and you're good to go. This is a small little spring right here. Applies pressure on the film canister to keep it from rattling around. Pressure plate, of course, its role is to keep the film flat against your film gate, so when you take your photo, the film is as flat as possible, and presumably you get a nice sharp photo, corner to corner, edge to edge, top to bottom. This material that they use, it's not a natural material. It feels like it's an embossed material. Well, leather's embossed as well. This feels more like a rubber-like material, but anyway, it's very clean, bonded very tightly to the body, and it does its job. It has 2 flash synchronization posts. Well, I'm not really sure. You know what? Not really sure what this one is. That's a little bit unusual because you have a small socket here for a threaded cable release. And on the front of the camera, you have your synchronization port for your flash. You'll notice that this camera has no hot shoe, no accessory shoe. There are some channels on either side of the viewfinder, which would seem to indicate that perhaps there was an accessory shoe that slotted onto the back, and that wasn't unusual. I saw that with another number of cameras that offered that possibility in that time period. I hinted at this, or I mentioned this, because this camera is a fixed lens camera. It does sort of cut down on your ability to take both wide angle and telephoto lenses because you only get one lens. So I hope you like your choices as long as it's 50 millimeters. However, around that time, Vivitar, which was a photographic company, not a photographic manufacturer, anyway, Vivitar offered these auxiliary lenses. One was a telephoto, and if you flip it over to the other side, one was a wide angle. And so the case held both auxiliary lenses. It held both supplemental lenses. There we go. And so these simply screwed into the filter ring or the front of the lens. All right, let's try this one. That one seems to be a little tricky. All right, so that one went in very easily. This is a wide angle. And so because you're using single lens reflex viewing, there was no adjustment of it. You just, whatever you saw through the viewfinder was correct. Okay, this one's odd. It actually had a filter ring attached to it, and that's why it wouldn't attach. So, although it did add some length to it, it didn't make it look sort of dorky, I guess is to use a bizarre expression. So it didn't really look too dorky with it. And if you think about it, however, these would degrade the image slightly. It might not degrade it by much, but it would degrade it somewhat. So these probably would be best used outdoors, or at least in three-dimensional situations where you might not notice the effect. I could see this being used as a portrait lens. Regardless, I'd probably stop it down to, if possible, to like f8, 11, or 16. With 8 and 11 probably be the preferred aperture setting. So I'm going to take a roll film and I'll pop some photos into this video, and I'll mark which ones I used it and at what aperture. I think that'll be interesting to note. I don't know what the heck is going on with this filter ring. I don't even know why it's in there. So I think we can just say we don't need that, because this one has no filter ring and this one has no filter ring. So it makes no sense that this would have a filter ring. If you watch that first video, you'll notice, if you watch the unboxing video, you'll notice that this camera really did not work correctly when I first took it out of the box. I couldn't get the shutter to fire correctly. In fact, as I wound the camera, the shutter would just release. Doesn't usually happen. Oh, look, it fires right away. And so I was trying to understand exactly what it was. I assumed that it was probably dried lubrication in the entire mechanism that controls both the mirror and the shutter. Leaf shutter is open like this, by the way, open, close. And but I was wrong. So I was able to remove the lens, and so the easiest way to do that is to remove these small screws here. There's 1, 2, and then 3. Remove those screws, and the entire lens just lifts away from the assembly. From there, I was able to determine, well, there are 2 collars, and the 2 collars each have a set of prongs. The prongs need to straddle the post. So what had happened was this post somehow ended up outside of the prongs. And because it was outside of the prongs, it was throwing off everything. So once I got everything reset, then it worked correctly. I went ahead and did a light lubrication of the shutter, even though I couldn't reach it. It became more difficult. I think I probably would have to get in here and remove one of the screws, but I wasn't sure which one. And in fact, it didn't really matter because the shutter did seem to work correctly, but trying to flush what I could in the shutter was never a bad thing. Even though the shutter itself wasn't sluggish, and the slow speeds buzzed fairly nicely. While I was there, I decided to remove the top deck. So if you want to remove the top deck on this camera, you have to remove this little ring that sits in front of the metering eye. Sometimes the easiest way to do that is just to get an eraser or a piece of rubber. And once you do that, then this piece comes off very easily. And you can see the metering circuitry, or you can see the circuitry for the metering. And so it's not through the lens metering, but it's right through that eye. So after you remove that, then there's a small collar here that must be removed. In order to do that, of course, you have to remove the rewind crank. And that's done fairly simply by jamming something into the fork and twisting counterclockwise on the rewind crank. See, then the rewind crank comes off. This, to remove this little disc, you're going to need a spanner wrench with the pointers. and that came off fairly cleanly. Then there's a small collar with a small brass collar with a circular relief spring under that. Remove this screw, and then to remove the entire thing, you're going to lift it up and then tilt it forward, because of the way this is constructed. Oh, it's a little bit difficult to see. Okay, so anyway, the front of the prism housing actually wraps around this surround right here. This surround actually has a piece of metal that comes out, and the front of the mirror housing wraps on top of that. So that's why you have to lift this up, tilt it forward, and then bring it off. So while I was doing all that, I thought, you know what, let me clean the viewfinder, because the viewfinder was very dirty. So the prism is held in place by three brass screws, which are easy to remove. Additionally, there are two more that just hold this plastic frame to the eyepiece. Now the eyepiece and the prism are bonded together, so there's no reason to try to pull those apart. The way it's made, there's no way dust can accumulate or dust can enter the space that's between the eyepiece and the pentaprism, and that normally is not true. Usually you do get dust between the eyepiece and then the pentaprism, but in this case it didn't. So I took it out, I cleaned the prism, I cleaned the top of the viewfinder, which I was trying to remove but didn't need to, and because I was able to remove the entire lens, I was then able to clean the other side of the viewfinder and also clean the mirror. With the viewfinder, you always want to be somewhat careful, or very careful as much as possible, because you don't want to scratch it. With the mirror, you want to take care, because it's a front surface mirror, but you don't have to be as careful, and that's simply because the mirror plays no role in forming the image. However, you still don't want to scratch it. So I used a combination of short bursts of compressed air with the camera held upside down so that any debris would then fall out of the camera. And then afterward, I would shake it a few times to make sure if there was anything loose. In fact, I would actually shake it a little bit while I was hitting it with compressed air. And that way it would make sure that any debris in there would then fall out through the front of the camera. Afterward, I put it all back together again, and I made sure all those prongs were mating with the posts. I tested it a couple times, then I replaced these screws, and then the easiest way for me to test the aperture, was put the shutter on B, release the shutter and hold your finger down, and then turn the aperture post, or turn the aperture ring. See, and that way I could see the aperture open and close. Now this has a different way of setting the film speed. So to set the film speed, in fact, there are two film speed notations. One is marked in ASA, and the other one is marked in DIN. DIN was the European guide for setting film speeds, and ASA was the American. Eventually they merged them, or they really dumped DIN, and ASA became ISO. So it's equivalent. 50 ASA is ISO, or ASA 50 is the same as ISO 50. And so to change the film speed, there's a small little post here. You pull out the post and you turn the ring until the desired film speed shows up in that very tiny window. And once you're finished, you drop it, rotate it probably a little bit. There, you can hear that snap into place, and you're good to go. This has a single stroke film advance, meaning that you wind the film in one increment. It's not ratcheted. If you let go and it's only partially wound, you still have to complete that stroke. A ratcheted stroke means you can advance it in small increments, and that's just not the case here. The film advance pushes into the body, so it's actually not extended, so you sort of have to reach up with your thumb and grab it and push. Not difficult. What's a bit different is that the shutter release. Now the shutter release has very little height to it. Most shutter releases have more standoff, but it's neither good nor bad. It's just worth noting. The viewfinder image, well, let's get my board. Let's talk about the viewfinder. So the viewfinder is fairly traditional. It has a match needle system, and the way it works is on this side, there's a little intrusion into the viewfinder, and then your needle actually is up here. So your needle will then move down, and so the idea is you adjust your aperture, your shutter speed, until your meter needle is here. And of course that would indicate correct exposure. Now there's a small green flag in the upper left corner. And the green flag only comes into the viewfinder when the film has been wound. So if there's no green flag, it means you need to advance the film. Now in the center, you have a horizontally split image surrounded by a ground glass collar, which actually is centered, but you get the idea. And then the rest of this is a Fresnel screen. And it's you'll see it has like concentric circles around the whole viewfinder. They're more tightly spaced, and they're even. But that's just to give you an idea what the viewfinder looks like. There are no indications of shutter speed or aperture in the viewfinder. Generally, I found this to be a pretty well-made camera. My only criticism might be that this front ring is made of a light alloy because because there are several scratches in here, and I'm working to polish them out of there. And if this was steel, for example, they wouldn't have those scratches and little dings. So how would I rate this camera? Overall, I give it an 8.8, which is a pretty decent rating. There are a couple things that give me pause, and that's some of its features. By nearly the mid-1960s, you're starting to see a lot of manufacturers offer cameras with interchangeable lenses. And to have a fixed lens with a leaf shutter, that just is really sort of out of step with what was going on at the time. Overall, this is a nice camera. I don't think you could consider it to be a great camera because you can always tell, because decades later, you think about what cameras are being discussed and which ones aren't being discussed, and you rarely ever see this one mentioned. Whoever owned this camera took good care of it. There's really no damage to the body, aside from these couple scratches up here. There's no impact damage. There's no dents or anything, and you don't feel any depressions in the back. And there is a small one right here in the prism housing. It doesn't touch a prism, but there is a small depression there. But considering this camera was made in 1960, so that was, depending on when you're viewing this, roughly 6 decades ago, I think it's in remarkably good condition. I hope we're all in this good a condition when we reach our 6th decade of life. And that's a wrap on the Kowa SE, or Kowa SE. I hope you enjoyed this video, and don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. If there's a particular camera that you'd like me to review, let me know in the comments below, or send me an email at contact@camera-talk.net. I'll be happy to actually go out and buy one. Until next time, get out there and take some photographs.